So Ida B. Wells, she was a real famous black lady who had written during the times of the lynchings that were happening after Reconstruction had ended. Reconstruction ended in 1877. Reconstruction was the idea that blacks and whites were going to get along. It was after the Civil War, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was passed. But after 1877, the federal government removed the troops from the South, and then the occupation of the South was over. And after the occupation of the South was over, then you had the Mississippi Plan, where there was the Ku Klux Klan started using violence, and they started using violence right before Election Day to intimidate voters to not go vote. And it wound up being effective, and so then the Mississippi Plan was copied all throughout the South. So when Ida B. Wells was investigating the reasons for the lynchings, she discovered that a number of the victims who were lynched was not for rape, but instead they were for having sexual relations with consenting white women. So nobody in this section of the community believes that old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. The Southern men are not careful. A conclusion might be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. And so a lot of times you would have the family patriarch in the community would put pressure on the white women to cry rape even if the relationship was consensual. So when it comes to the lynching of black men, most of the lynchings were of black men. There's women there too, but most of the time it was black men, and about 1/3 of those cases were for rape, and then about 4/5 of those so-called rape cases would have been called adultery and not rape. So you know that's 4/5 of the rape cases were lies. They were not rape. They were lies by the white women, and it's because what, daddy had caught her. You know, she's sitting there schlupping, you know, the slave in the back in the quarters, in the slave quarters, and while she's sitting there probably raping him, right, since she's got the power, and that's how sexual harassment works. Those with power should not use that power in order to get sexual favors, so she gets sexual favors, and then as soon as daddy finds out about it, she lies about it and says that it was rape. And why I think this is really significant is because the Ku Klux Klan was defending white women. So, you know, we want to talk about the intersectionality of where, you know, who's got power and who doesn't have power when it comes to race and sexuality and gender. The white women have a lot more power than what people would actually give them credit for, because even the Ku Klux Klan was defending white women. So even the worst terrorist organization, homegrown terrorist organization here in the United States, was protecting white women. So though the exponential increase in lynching did not begin until the late 1880s, the upward trend had already begun a decade earlier. Casual articles with headlines like "A Rascal Lynch" were fairly common in newspapers in 1870s. Already much of the Southern public was blinded with fear and rage at the idea of a black man with a white woman. A lynching was most likely to occur in cases where a black man had been convicted of outraging a white woman. You even had Emmett Till, who was murdered brutally. He was murdered brutally because he supposedly whistled at a white woman, right? That's all it took, was to whistle at a white woman, and then, you know, he had got brutally murdered. So the lack of conviction did not mean whites presupposing the accused Negro's innocence. In Cairo, Mississippi, for example, a black man arrested for attempted rape of a white girl was taken from the jailhouse by a number of citizens and hanged. Threats of extra-legal executions for black men were accepted almost as normal when a white woman's integrity and supposed virginity were at stake. Many newspaper accounts failed to even mention the suspect's name. One sentence account in the Richmond Daily Dispatch relayed a Mason County, Kentucky incident. A Negro was shot dead in Mason County yesterday for rape. Okay, so that happens in Kentucky. And, you know, the Ku Klux Klan, what's the argument? I mean, what it is that they're saying, it's the men who's doing the thing, and they're doing it in, you know, in a feigned protest for defense of their women. And so what it means is that the Ku Klux Klan and these white men are defending white womanhood. White womanhood, they're pious, they're perfect, they're moral, and how dare you, you know, outrage this perfect creation by God. How dare you do that? So they're protecting white womanhood, and in their protection of white womanhood, they're lynching black people. And what is ironic about it is they're defending this pious white woman who's a liar, who's, either raping the man or having sex, with him, under the guise of night. And as soon as it's found out, she immediately lies and says, "Oh no, Daddy, he raped me. And then, then the dude's either shot dead or he's lynched. So why did rape merit the death penalty? Only in cases where the accused was white and the victim was where the accused was black and the victim was a white woman. The Civil War ripped apart the Southern social structure. White men were no longer the unquestioned masters of their region. The threat of white-black racial amalgamation coupled with post-slavery black competition in social and economic spheres struck fear into the hearts of white men across the South and compelled them to reassert their power over both their women and the black men who were their competition. During Reconstruction, scattered incidents of lynching foreshadowed an exponential rise during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Lynchings in 1873 and those that occurred 2 decades later differed only in their frequency and intensity. By the last decade of the 19th century, lynching had become the ultimate public expression of white male dominance, whereas they're complete with cameras, newspaper announcements, and special excursion trains chartered for urban whites to view the ritual and extended torture of African American men and even women in rural areas. A couple of days before Christmas 1896, white citizens of Mayfield, Kentucky were preparing for an attack in response to a report that up to 250 armed African Americans were seeking revenge for the lynching of Jim Stone and the white capping of African American families. The reports had come from Water Valley and Wingo, Kentucky, and other nearby towns. White women and children in Mayfield were ordered off the street by 6 p.m. Homes were barricaded. A dispatch was sent to Fulton, Kentucky, asking for a reinforcement of white men, and guards were posted at the railroad station. When a report arrived stating that African Americans were also arming themselves in Paducah, Kentucky, the fire bell was rung in Mayfield and a defense was positioned in the public square to await the attack. The reinforcements from Fulton arrived by train a little after midnight. Will Suett, an 18-year-old African American, was also at the train station, was gunned down. Shots were fired at 3 other African Americans. Hundreds of shots were fired into buildings and into the trees. 4 homes were burnt down. By Christmas Eve, the threat was over. The reinforcements were sent home. A mass meeting was called. A petition was signed by more than 100 African Americans asking for peace between the races. 3 people have been killed, one being Will Suett. And Will Suett was the 18-year-old who had arrived by train from St. Louis. He was returning home to spend Christmas with his family in Mayfield. And this is, New York Times, 12/24/1896. So this is after Jim Stone was lynched. And why was Jim Stone lynched? Well, out of George C. Wright's Racial Violence in Kentucky, on page 75, it talks about that. It says that there is a bunch of people that had died in Mayfield. 3 blacks had died at the hands of a mob. And they said, commenting on the murder of the citizens in the section in which the Negro lived, while deploring the necessity of violence, are glad to be rid of him, as he appeared to have been a bad man and one whom the community can well afford to spare, right? So, it's always like some bad man, right? Even if he didn't do the thing, it's like, well, he had a bad character, who gives a shit? The very next day, Jim Stone was in jail on the charge of rape. He was carried to the courthouse yard and hanged. And the mob pinned a note to his body listing the names of several blacks who were to leave town or suffer the same fate. So, Tom Chambers, a black alleged to be involved in shady activities, armed himself in anticipation of the mob. Chambers opened fire on his attackers when they came to destroy his establishment, repulsing them. In response to Chambers' act of meeting violence with violence, practically every white man and boy in Mayfield and the surrounding countryside armed himself. By daylight, several hundred whites had assembled at the courthouse, poised for an attack from blacks. Every road in the town was watched. That afternoon, a local black, Will Suett, arrived by train from St. Louis, unaware of the recent lynchings, but afraid of the armed men. Will Suett started running away as soon as the mob approached him. Refusing to halt on command, he was killed in a hail of gunfire. The death of this innocent man seemed to take much of the fight from the angry whites. They now realized that no group of blacks was making plans to attack the town. City officials ordered everyone, white as well as black, off the streets by 10 p.m. and declared that Suett's death was unprovoked. Some white citizens immediately announced their intention to raise funds to help support his aged mother. So, why did this race riot in Mayfield happen? They said that Jim Stone had raped a woman, right? But if that had been true, why were they afraid that there was going to be this big race riot that was happening? Essentially what happened was white people just scared themselves. They just scared the shit out of themselves. So basically, you know, when a lynching would happen, the whole community would take a picture, and the whole white community was in on it. They didn't cover their faces or anything. They would take pictures, and then they would send these postcards all across America. So the whole society was in favor of lynching black men, right? They didn't care that their faces were exposed because they didn't think that they would get caught or that they would get in any trouble for, you know, murdering and whether the guy was guilty or not. It didn't matter. They just knew that they wouldn't get in trouble. It's a racial, white, totalitarian dictatorship. You know, white people have to get the criminal justice system, whereas black folks, they were just getting lynched out in the street by mob justice. So, you know, that's something that had happened in Kentucky, and then it happens over and over again. So there's a couple things with Kentucky racism that I think warrants, you know, mentioning. You had Abraham Lincoln, who came out of Kentucky, and Jefferson Davis. So the Civil War was literally brother versus brother here, whereas most of the Kentuckians fought for the North. 100,000 fought for the North, whereas 25,000 fought for the South. So there's way more that fought for the Union than had fought for the South. So Abraham Lincoln came from Kentucky, and he had said that he hopes to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky. He realized the strategic value of having Kentucky in his war. You know, the central placement, the central location of the state just made it very essential. Kentucky is also home of Margaret Garner, the slave woman from Boone County who ran to Cincinnati for freedom and was caught, and she killed her daughter, her 2-year-old daughter, so that way she would not have to go back into slavery and just be raped repeatedly as she had been done. She was only 20-something years old, 22 or 23 years old. So Margaret Garner, that comes out of, that's Beloved. You had Toni Morrison, who wrote the book Beloved, and the movie, which was based on something that happened right here in Kentucky. Uncle Tom's Cabin was inspired by the slave auction in Maysville, in Mason County, right? So we had learned about a Mason County man who had got shot, a black man who got shot over racism. We just, you know, I just read about it, and now we're talking about a slave auction that had happened, and it inspired her to write Uncle Tom's Cabin because she was so outraged at how black folks were being treated, just like cattle, right? Just here's naked black people. Do you want this one? Do you want that one? Separating families, and it was just, she was just absolutely shocked about it. So that's a couple. There's also the 1976 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was passed, in which I'm sort of mixed about that because they didn't pass it right after the Civil War, right? They fought against it. So in a way, the federal government said that slavery was over, but the Kentucky officials, the Confederates, ran Kentucky probably about 100 or so years after the Civil War was over. So Kentucky was known as a state that had gone Confederate after the Appomattox. After the end of the Civil War, they went Confederate. And so they didn't pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment until 1976, you know, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and 40 years ago. And so 40 years ago is when they finally passed it. So I'm mixed about it because, you know, we finally passed it, and when you pass it again, it reinforces those things. The 13th Amendment, someone had pointed out that basically slavery is illegal unless you can put a crime on them, and so that's where you get the new Jim Crow. If you can put a crime on a person, then you can make them into a slave, and so that's how the new Jim Crow slavery is happening today. That's why you have a disproportionate population in the prison systems, and then once you have them in prison, then you can make them pick up your garbage on the street and do all this other free labor. So it was passed, and good thing that it was finally passed, and it was ceremonially passed, right? So it didn't actually it was the law of the land, and so it didn't change anything, but it did reinforce and reestablish that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were, you know, good. And so right now we have Rand Paul, who's against these amendments. He's talking about the 14th Amendment, which talks about your citizenship. If you're born on this land, then you're a citizen, and he's against that because of the anchor babies. He's saying that Mexicans are flying the border, having a baby, and then because they have the baby on American soil, they become citizens, and he's against that. He don't want, you know, I don't know, I mean, he's white, so I mean, I don't see how he could really make any justification against how he had got here, right? White people, Europeans got here, they had kids on this soil, they did the same thing. They didn't have any papers, they didn't, you know, they were illegal immigrants. And so that's the 14th Amendment, and he's also against civil rights. He thinks that private businesses should be allowed to discriminate against anybody that they want to. The idea is it's a free market, so if somebody discriminates against black folks in their establishment, then that establishment should go down. Or it might arise, and it could create like I don't know, a nice bastion for the neo-Nazi Confederates. And so that's Rand Paul, our senator from Kentucky right now is against the Civil Rights Act and against voters' rights. And he gives lip service to, well, back then, there's institutionalized discrimination, but I think intellectual, his theoretical argument is that says that if you want to discriminate against people, you're allowed to discriminate against people. Same thing for homosexuals. 75% of the Kentucky people had voted in favor of outlawing gay marriage, and so if a gay person comes into your establishment, they had to leave. It's not true now.